Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to the Mérode for tonight's discussion on one of the most influential figures in modern art, Marcel Duchamps. This leading artistic figure redefined the very essence of art with his concept of ready-mades. He reimagined the role of the artist and laid the foundation for conceptual and contemporary art. Tonight, we are honored to host a conversation on Duchamp's enduring legacy, featuring two distinguished guests, Jeanne Brun and Kendell Geers. Jeanne Brun, Deputy Director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne Centre Pompidou, will be the co-curator of the Marcel Duchamp retrospective at the Grand Palais in Paris. Joining her is Kendell Geers, an artist whose work has been deeply influenced by Duchamp. Last year, he wrote Duchamp's Endgame, Da Vinci, Dürer, Ingres, and Poussin, a book tracing the true origins of Duchamp's work back to Renaissance and neoclassical masters, published by Fonds Mercator, and that you will be able to discover at the end of the conference. Once again, we are very happy to organize this conversation with our partner Glean magazine. Thank you, Kathleen, for moderating this insightful discussion. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I wish you all a lovely evening.
Thank you all for being here tonight on a Friday evening. I have to admit that I'm totally surprised, actually, that so many people turned up tonight. Because I have this prejudice about Duchamp and Belgium. I always thought that Belgians weren't too fond of this artist, despite the fact that he's a very important artist. So I'm very happy to welcome you all, and I'm very honored, Jeanne, to have you here tonight. I know you are very, very busy. And Kendell, we've been collaborating quite a lot. It was actually last summer, just before the summer holidays, that you called me. I have this book. I made this book, Duchamp's Endgame. And then you were flipping through it, and I thought, okay, I'm going to hand you over the book, he said. And then we ended up talking like 2 hours about your fascination for Duchamp. And then Kendell made this wonderful work that we put on the cover of Glean, and you wrote 3 texts for the magazine, and we end with an interview in the upcoming magazine, which will appear in June. Yes. So there is a lot to say about Duchamp, of course. But before that, Jeanne, I was in Paris last weekend, and I visited this great exhibition that you put together, Apocalypse, Hier et Demain. It's still running. People hurry to go to Paris to see it before the 8th of June. It's a great show in the BNF, the National Library of Paris, which is in itself an amazing place to visit. It's really the biggest library you can imagine. And you made a show on the apocalypse. What a subject.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you, Kendell. Remember the moment you came to Paris and we were in that, room with Laurent Lebon, the president of the Centre Pompidou, and started talking about your book and about Duchamp. And thank you for mentioning the Apocalypse show. It seems far from Duchamp, but we're gonna end up understanding tonight that Duchamp is everywhere. So there even is a link between Duchamp and the Apocalypse through the Cavalier de l'Apocalypse. But thank you for mentioning it. I've done this on my previous position when I was director of the Museum of the National Library back in 2021 until 2023 when I joined the Pompidou. And yes, it's, I delved into the history of the apocalypse and its representations through history of art from Dürer, and we're going to talk about Dürer tonight, till contemporary artists.
Yeah, because this is, of course, the link that I wanted to make also. It's Dürer, and he's here in the back. And so, Kendell, in your book, you put Duchamps and Dürer together. Explain.
Well, unfortunately for you, and fortunately for me, I've been instructed to keep it simple, sweet, and concise. And so I will not be able to go into all the details, but the book is available. There are very few copies left because it's already been a year that's being sold, and it wasn't a massive edition, in which I go into the details. And it's really that, it's about the details. And for those of you who don't know the story of Duchamps, it begins in 1912 when he presents a work of art in the Cubist Salon in Paris called Nude Descending the Staircase. His brothers who are on the committee and the other artists on the committee say to him, the painting is quite cubist, a little bit too futurist, but there's a problem with the title because nudes don't descend. They certainly don't stand up, but they don't descend, they recline. Change the title. And he says, I can't change the title because it's written on the painting. Now, this is significant because he writes it on the painting. And then they say to him, well, then take your painting. So he takes a taxi, he takes the painting, he leaves, he's disappointed, he's furious, and he goes to Munich for 3 months.
And we are now in?
1912, June to October 1912. And he comes back from Munich and he says, everything has changed. And this is the origin of the ready-made. This is the origin of everything. This is, in Munich, he decides to stop painting. And it is the holy grail for a lot of art historians, what happens in Munich. But he gives us absolutely no keys, no clues. We don't know. He says he went to the Alte Pinakothek every day. He spoke about Lucas Cranach, the colors and the old man. Now, you're going to have to go and read the book if you want to have a full understanding how that all works. But essentially what the book takes as its point of departure is, since we don't know anything about what Duchamps meant and what he was doing in Munich, let's look at the works, just the works themselves, just the images, just look as an artist at another artist, and in that way it opens up. You have a totally different reading which shifts the parameters. And what I propose in the book is that, in fact, art history is an open source language that each generation of artists tweaks and adjusts, copies, pastes, edits. And so I begin with this image simply because you have Marcel Duchamp in a fur coat and Albrecht Dürer in a fur coat. And it's more complex than that. But if you look at the hand gestures, there are a lot of parallels. And if you can pass me no, not the book, the thing, thank you. The thing. All right. And in fact, what the book proposes is that he wasn't in Munich to visit the museum, the Alte Pinakothek, as most art historians, as Duchamp himself said. He was there to visit the library, because in the library, like a block away from the museum, is Dürer's original notebooks. And so what you see here on the left is Marcel Duchamp's sketches from his notes, and Albrecht Dürer's notes on the right. And I mean, there are further images in the book. There's a lot of parallels, and I believe that one of the things that Duchamp did was he left a lot of notes, a box of notes. And in fact, Dürer's book was also a box of notes. And you see here a work that Duchamp makes of, the pointer doesn't work, on your left there, which is called To Be Looked At Closely for an Hour with One Eye. And if you look at the circle and the obelisk you will see the same thing over here, the circle and the obelisk of Dürer's notebooks, and Dürer's perspective machine at the top. Because, I have to go quickly, Dürer makes that painting in 1500. He says he's going to Bologna to meet somebody who's going to teach him the art of perspective. This is clearly a man who doesn't need to learn perspective. And Dürer then makes that image at the top, which is his image of perspective. But you'll see a parallel. If you look at the object in the middle of the table and Duchamp's object, it's the same, down to the detail of the obelisk in front of the eye. And if you open Duchamps, this is one of his major works, the Valise. When you open it up, it has the same composition. There you see an image from Dürer's notebooks, and there you see Duchamp's work. You see very clearly, I'm going very fast here, but essentially what happens in Munich is he makes 3 drawings and 2 paintings. And it's the blueprint for the rest of his life. He makes a work on the left, which is called The Bride, and on the right, The Passage from Virgin to Bride. And he capitalizes, again, on the bottom right, left-hand corner, he writes The Passage in capital letters, Passage, from Virgin to Bride. And it's all based on the central figure here. You see the strange round shape. And he speaks about this work in terms of the key to which eventually becomes the large glass and everything that comes after. And in my research, I began to wonder whether the way, based on his notes, which I will come to in a minute, whether Duchamp's painting on the right is in fact based on Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Virgin on the Rocks. And here you see what I did was I took overlays and I lined up the Duchamp painting. They're different dimensions, but when you line up the halo and the stick of John the Baptist, and you line up the 2 paintings, they align 100%. Except that Leonardo made 2 versions of the Virgin on the Rocks, and Duchamp made 2 versions of the Bride. So one of the things he said is the halo is the most important part of the picture. Graphically, like a surface, it is in general the halo, the sum total of a splendid vibration. There you see on the left, that's the same figure that starts in the 2 paintings. And there you see an etching of the image, and he puts in the bottom of the etching the detail of the halo. That was the key that he's giving us to look more closely. He also says that figure, which he calls the pendu femelle, he says in his notes, it's in ordinary perspective, the shape of a hanged woman whose true form one should look to find, so perhaps try to find. He's telling us in his notes, look for the detail, look for what is he actually depicting. He made 2 paintings of the same subject, Leonardo made 2 paintings of the same subject, and indeed I line up the second version and you get exactly the same correlation down to, you see the back of John the Baptist lines up, the back of Jesus lines up, the back of John the Baptist, the hand of Jesus, the eyes, even the fabric of the Virgin Mary is in the composition of Duchamp. There you see another, I just photoshopped the details so you can see the alignment. And then in one of the most key notes that he gives us, he speaks about the possibility of recognizing 2 similar objects and reach the impossibility of sufficient visual memory to transfer from one like object to another the memory imprint. This is the key, is that Duchamp is actually speaking about the fact that we've lost the ability to read images. We've lost the ability to look at 2 identical images and realize they're the same image. And then very quickly, because I don't want it to turn into a lecture, this work was the key work. It's one of the 3 drawings, and it is the title work which eventually becomes his magnum opus, the Bride Stripped Bare by the Bachelors. It's a drawing, and it is the key to Duchamp's work there, which is about a bride and frustrated bachelors. Unfortunately, there's not time to go into the detail of how the bride and the frustrated bachelors work. But Raphael makes a painting, which is the marriage of the Virgin Mary, which is indeed, and Raphael says, you have the bride over there, and then over here you have the frustrated bachelor, and this bachelor is so frustrated he breaks a stick. in order to expose his frustration. And indeed, when I align the image of the drawing of Marcel Duchamps and I put it on top of the Raphael, even the detail of the stick being broken aligns. In the center of the drawing, you have a number of little rings. That's where the bride is, where the Virgin Mary is receiving the rings of Joseph. He gives her a bride's veil. He points out the halo of Joseph. He points, on the left and the right, a nice detail. He circles the eyes of a male and a female witness to the wedding. He's really, literally copying, well, not copying, but he's structurally tracing the architectural skeleton of the Raphael, as he did to the Leonardo. And from that skeleton, he then fleshes out his abstract compositions, which are absolutely not abstract at all. And there you see the detail of the rings being received, and it lines exactly with her hands. And the other works, there are a number of other alignments, but I just stopped there as a way to pose the challenge, because Duchamp, when he comes back from Munich, he says that he is tired of art that is just retinal and visual. And he says that he wants to restore art to the service of the mind. Now, the service of the mind is not simply about making art conceptual, but it is also art historical. It's about going into the depths of being able to look at art, to be able to see it for more than appearances, to see it for more than the color, the line, and the shape, but the structural, iconographical, symbolic layers of what is art history.
Thank you, Kendell.
Was that short enough?
It was short enough. We can talk about it like for a week, I think, and even more.
I have done lectures on Duchamp that takes 3 hours.
Yeah. But
and that was only by myself.
Actually, what is interesting me in this talk is, of course, I have an artist on my left side, I have an art historian on my right side. And so actually what you are saying, in a way, in your book, by analyzing, is we don't look good enough at artworks, and we analyze it from a historical point of view, and the art historians, well, they are putting a lot of theory together, but do they really look at the artwork? And so, Jeanne, this is a question for you, of course, because you are working now on an anniversary exhibition, which will take place in 2027 on Duchamps, and which is kind of an anniversary show remembering the 1977 show that took place in Centre Pompidou, which was the inaugurational show, and which was a retrospective on Marcel Duchamp.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Kendell put it before, the pressure's on me. No, because there are lots of Duchampians, we call them Duchampians, art historians, artists fascinated by the work of Duchamp that's so open that it allows for a lot of people to think that there's a special link between them and Marcel Duchamp, and perhaps it's true. So there has been lots of shows on Duchamp, but actually I love the way we just skipped from Duchamp's paintings and influences to the image just before that was a view of the 1977 exhibition at the Centre Pompidou. Because you see, it has almost nothing to see with each other. And it just shows that there are millions, like literally thousands of views of Duchamp's work. And you can put it in so many different ways. And I had assembled just 3 views of exhibitions to show that you can see Duchamp's work. I mean, of course, Duchamp's work is very varied also within itself, but you can see his work in a multitude of contexts. So the Duchamp show of 1977, for example, decided that actually the curator Pontus Hulten, and he had lots of co-curators, Jean Clair, Jacques Comon, and Jennifer Go Cooper, who's also from South Africa. And they had decided to gather objects that would explain Duchamp's work with his own biography. So the first image that you had was a market hall in Normandy, because Duchamp, of course, is born in Normandy, and so to a lot of people, that context explains a lot of his work, especially a lot of his early work, but some commentators think that, the context of his birth and where he was raised explain a lot of his work. And then you have another view here in the Dada show from 2005, where you can see, of course, the fountain in the context of works by Picabia in the background, and it's the way we are used to seeing Duchamp as an iconoclast, as someone who has really shattered art history in the beginning of the 20th century and began something new. And there was a third view of an exhibition, but perhaps it's somewhere. That's the show that was held at the Centre Pompidou as well, 10 years ago, that was on Duchamp in painting. So the question is Duchamp someone just from Normandy? Is he this hero of modern art, as it was shown in Dada, or is he a painter? Is he a good painter? Is he a bad painter? Because he gave up painting, of course. So there are millions of views you can have by Duchamp. And the idea, for me, the way I was interested in your book, is that can't we just look at the work first? And where does it lead us?
I think this is a very important question, of course, and this is exactly the question that you are raising. And what is interesting, too, is that you... you actually started investigating Duchamp because he gave up painting, and you were doing or thinking of doing the inverse, like starting to paint.
Well, as it happened, I was in Munich in 2012, exactly 100 years after Duchamp, and I was preparing a retrospective which had fallen foul of the art system, and I was in a deep depression because I literally had to sign a contract in which I was excluded from my own retrospective. And a number of things were going on where I felt disillusioned from the art world because a lot of my works had been picked up by other artists who were getting credit for what I was making. But it was in the ready-made logic. And I concluded that if the work was so easy to copy, then there might be a problem with the logic. And I made a very irrational decision. I decided that I'm going to start painting. Duchamp stopped painting in Munich, and I decided in Munich to start painting. And the reasons why I did that were very personal, that I would do something that was not possible to copy because it would be so eccentric or unique or personal, but also to take up the ultimate challenge. I think for any artist, I think painting is it's got this long, long history. But in order for me to justify painting, I needed to understand why Duchamp stopped in the first place. And I decided to go into an interrogation of that process. And I'd studied Duchamp for many, many years, but I went into a very deep channeling of the trying to understand how Duchamp was thinking. It was not just what he was thinking, but how did he make his work? How did he think? What was he seeing in his mind's eye? I tried to get into that point of view. And then you realize that he said that he was against retinal art. On the other hand, he was giving key. I've already mentioned the work of art that says to be looked at with one eye closely for almost an hour. The most famous work that perhaps everybody might recognize, which I'm sure it'll come up at some point in the image loop, is the one where he has the Mona Lisa, and then at the bottom of the Mona Lisa he has the letters L-H-O-O-Q, which in French alliterates phonetically to say L-H-O-O-Q. But at the same time, when he made that postcard, he was living in New York. And in New York, if you take the letters, it says, look. His magazine that he was editing in New York was called Blind Man. He made works called Ocular Witness. He was constantly drawing attention to this idea of looking. And his statement to say that he was against retinal art, people have interpreted to say there's nothing to look at. And I don't think that's true. I think he was against, now, when he goes to Munich in 1912, the big thing that happens in Munich, there you see the L-H-O-O-Q. The big thing that happens in Munich in 1912 is Kandinsky publishes a book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And in this book, he says, the vulgar herd, that's his words, the vulgar herd go into a gallery or a museum, and they talk about the colors and the images, and they talk about the visual aspects of art. And this is what we call art for art's sake. And Kandinsky was rallying against that. And I think that what Duchamps was rallying against is this idea of reducing art to an image, that we had to scratch the surface to go deeper. And the mistake that we made, the readings of Duchamps was locked in by a lot of art historians who copy-paste each other across the different generations based on a consoling idea of what they want Duchamps to be. And perhaps the most important detail is in 1957, he gives a lecture called The Creative Act. And he introduces himself as a mere artist. And this text that he writes, or the speech that he gives, speaks about how the viewer is actually doing as much work to assign value and meaning to the work as the artist. And perhaps it's a confession that his work had been instrumentalized and weaponized and used by critics and curators and historians and galleries. And that, in fact, our idea of Duchamps has nothing to do with him. It's got altogether to do with what happens in America. And in the last issue of Glean, I go into the details as to the reasons behind how he was weaponized and instrumentalized by a system outside of his control.
Mm-hmm. Jeanne, as you said, the pressure is on you because you are working now on this retrospective. And so when you listen to Kendell and you read this book, did it challenge you in the way you are working on this exhibition?
Well, I think what he says about historians is very true. I mean, the difference between artists and art historians is that artists look better. I have to say, I used to teach, and I told my students, you need to have two legs. One leg is you observe the work, and the other leg is you gather data. So you read about the artists, you read about the works, and you know, it's the literary aspect. So what I find really interesting in Kendell's research is that he looks at the work, and it's like, for me, you can read this book as a detective investigation, looking at every detail, going from one detail to another, like opening false or wrong tracks, and then going back on the right trail because of the fact that you look each time at each painting. And
sorry to interrupt, but I just want to draw attention to this work, which I think is key to what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so that's one thing. I think it's a great investigation, and to me, what's interesting is not the conclusions in themselves. I mean, of course, they're interesting, but the fact that he sticks to the idea that all of Duchamp's work is a riddle. It's meant as a riddle. It's not a riddle to be deciphered. It's not something that he wants, that he means as a truth hidden, but really as a riddle. And so you have to look at his work, each work and the ensemble of his work, as fragments, a puzzle, a combination of different signs that you want to, try together, combine, or deconstruct. And I think the very meaning of his work, I wouldn't use the word truth because I think there is no, unified understanding of his work. But I think the meaning of his work lies in this character of riddle, fragmentation, puzzle. And that's why for me, you have to read this whole spirit of Duchamp in the context of the fin de siècle, what in French we call fin de siècle, which is the end of the 19th century, when these ideas were really, Rémy de Gourmont, for instance, but also Roussel were working a lot on these ideas of the plasticity of meaning itself. And I want to read a short text of Rémy de Gourmont, an essay called Dissociation of Ideas, that to me is a key to understanding Duchamp's work. I had to translate it into English, because of course it's French, but so is most of Duchamp's work. So the dissociation of ideas is from 1899, so Duchamp was 12 at that time, so he could have read it, of course. And it starts this way. There are two ways of thinking. Either you accept current ideas and association of ideas just as they are, or you undertake to form new associations, or, what is rarer, original disassociation of ideas. An intelligence capable of such efforts is, more or less, according to the degree, abundance, and variety of other gifts, a creative intelligence. It is a matter of either conceiving new relationships among old ideas and images, or of separating old ideas, old images united by tradition, and considering them one by one, being free to rework them and arrange an infinite number of new couplings, which a new operation will disunite once again until new ties, always fragile and equivocal, are formed. So sorry for the long excerpt, but I think it's very, very relevant to Duchamp's work because it is precisely what he's trying to do. When you look at each of his works, say the Grand Verre, but say, for instance, maybe the most iconic of all of his works, The Fountain, it is precisely the dissociation of two ideas. The idea of course, the urinoir, the urinal, that you make when you see the object, and he shifts it to the fountain. The idea of maybe the form of a Buddha that he implies with a friend in The Blind Man, but then it could also be the form of the Sacré-Cœur in Paris. So he puts all of these meanings in the same piece so as to allow the viewer to make his own associations, disassociations, and create a new meaning out of it. So it's a kaleidoscopic understanding of each work, and I think that's the part that's really important about Duchamp. It's to understand that he doesn't want us to have a simple, unified understanding of his works.
Mm-hmm. He's challenging us.
Can I respond to that quickly? I love the end of that quote, because you have truth and you have lies, and in the middle you have equivocation. And that's exactly what Duchamp does. It's equivocation, because it's neither true nor false. And it's in the equivocation that his work really opens up into something which is referring to the truth and the lies at the same time. And he's constantly testing us. It's about testing your intelligence.
And I'm going back
talking about the truth. Sorry,
because I
want to know this, like talking about the truth and the lies, because the story also goes, some people say that the Fountain was not a work by Duchamp, but by Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. So since I have like two experts sitting here, I would like to know, was it his or not?
Well, Duchamps was an artist and a man in general who would not be definite about what he was going to bring to the world. So, for instance, he was reluctant to show his own work. So he was reluctant to say that the work was his. And so he would have said probably, why not? I mean, what is important, in fact? Is it the piece, or is it the fact that I signed it with another name, Armot, or is it the fact that a woman signed it? What are we looking at when we're asking this question? So that's always this way of, mirroring our concerns. Okay, you asked this question, so what's important for you? What would it mean if it were Elsa from
Freitag?
I can never say that. Would the meaning of the piece itself change?
But that's the thing.
It's a question about authorship, of course.
But if he says it's a found object, does it matter if he finds it in a hardware store or if he finds it in another artist's studio? It's still the concept of the found object, which I take issue with because it's a very male, it's the idea of Christopher Columbus finding the Americas or Jan van Riebeeck finding South Africa. But I don't think that, in the last issue of Glean magazine, I addressed this particular urban legend very precisely because in the timeline, and you spoke about the word mirroring, so 1 year after he makes Armut, he flips the letters around and Mut becomes Tum, which becomes the final painting. So he leaves plenty of keys and evidence that he was the author of it. But whether he found the object in the studio of his lover or whether he found it in the studio or in the hardware store, that's not clear.
And that's where I go back to the image that you spoke about and that I wanted to highlight that may also answer your question, which is the Porte de la Rue Larrey. And maybe the answer of most questions about Duchamps is both, or I don't know, multiple. So this is the metaphor for the French expression, il faut qu'une porte soit ouverte ou fermée. It has to be open or closed. It's either way. But Duchamps, in his apartment in the Rue Larrey in Paris, decided that he didn't have to choose. The door would be open and closed. And so he had this, dispositif, this way. He had it constructed especially so as to fit this ambivalence between open, not this ambivalence, this co-presence, coexistence of being open and being closed.
Well, it was a small apartment, as we understood, and the door was in between and access to two different rooms. So when one room was open, the other was closed. It wasn't that the door was open and closed at the same time, but you couldn't go
the same door was open and closed at the same time.
But into two rooms, and
absolutely.
that's the thing, is that all of his work has this double way of reading. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I go into in my book is that, okay, my French is not perfect, but I can certainly read and understand French, is that one of the great disappointments in terms of the way the art historians have at least engaged Duchamps is most of the interpretation has been done in America. And I think that the great challenge for your exhibition at the Grand Palais is to restore the francophone, the French reading of his work, because the French jeu de mots and the French, apart from à la chaud au cul, but apart from that, the interchangeability between the French and the English, between the francophone, is an enormous gap in the research on Duchamps.
Because he left France, and when I was reading about a 1977 exhibition in Centre Pompidou, I read that Duchamps up till then had largely been ignored in France, actually, and that he was like a big name in the States already. So how come he was ignored for so long?
Well, I think this is a tricky question because Duchamps was always there and not there. So he was really, of course, his fame, really began when he went to the US, and there was this armory show, and all the phenomenon around Duchamps, not only his work, but also who he represented. This artist who was also the beginning of what we call a star. So that is very true. But then in the US as well, there's a time when he's less important as an artist, and he's being rediscovered again in two different artistic movements. We are used to say that he's the father of conceptual art. Of course, we understand that very well. But with the ready-made, the objects, he's also a big influence on pop art, for instance. So it's way later that artists like Joseph Kosuth, like Wesselmann, for example, decide that he's important for them. Or Hamilton, who has a very special relationship for him. In France, it's not exactly the same because it's not the same context. There's this whole family, for instance. And we know that even though he flew to the US in the early 1910s, he was a big fan of his brothers. The sculptor, the painter, Jacques Villon, and his sister, Suzanne Duchamps, as well. So he supported his work. And he was known as part of the Duchamps family. So his fame was not exactly the same, but he never really disappeared either.
And the European art history was fundamental to his work and is fundamental to understand it today. This is what you prove in your book.
Well, that's what I believe, but that's not the American reading. From the American point of view, they needed this iconoclastic dandy disconnected from Europe in order to justify pop art and even the abstract expressionists, because that's when he really gets starting to be quoted, is in the 1950s, when he makes the statement, "I'm a mere artist, I'm nothing more." And he becomes the Pope, which creates this idea of America as this unique, disconnected art tradition, and in many ways, I believe they manufacture the image of Duchamps, whereas in reality, he was deeply connected to his brothers and to European art history. And when you read his notes, he was always a painter, even if the image we have of him is that he said painting is dead, but he never actually really said painting is dead. We just assumed that that's what he meant. He said he stopped painting, but like everything that Duchamp did, he said he stopped making art to play chess, and then when he died, that we discovered, well, actually he made a whole lot of work while he was pretending to not be making art. And perhaps when he says he stopped making art to play chess, it's like when Dürer says, I'm going to study the art of perspective. Perhaps Dürer had another understanding of what perspective meant, and perhaps Duchamp equated playing chess with making art. And there was a work which, so this is the work which I find fascinating that I speak about in one of the articles for Glean, which he has the work has to be installed on top of a mirror. And at the bottom of the work, he has the text written in reverse in English, which says, why not sneeze Rose c'est la vie? Why does he choose English for the title? And then you have to do the multilingual shift between English and French, because on the top you have the dry cuttlefish, which in French you say sèche. But then if you do that in a mirror, it becomes chess. And these are the kinds of games that he was playing, very, very influenced by Raymond Roussel and the idea of phonetics rather than literal spelling. So it's not about reading the text, it's about hearing the text and the phonetic explanation of letters and words and how words sound.
So, Jeanne, you're now working on this new exhibition on Duchamps. It's ahead, it's in 27. But what I'm curious about is about after all these texts and analyses of Duchamp and writing and interpretations, and so what are you going to focus on?
Well, it's a work in process, but the main question is how do you make an exhibition on someone who so voluntarily tries to escape interpretation, or tries to open interpretation would be more exact. So what I'm thinking is, for someone who tries to escape, for instance, linear perspective, linear understanding, univocal perspective on his work again, how do you make a parcours, like a path that would be linear? So I'm thinking of an exhibition that, on the contrary of, for instance, the 1977 exhibition, tries to gather all of these visions on Duchamps. And that would be a prismatic perspective on Duchamps. And a good example of that would be to show that Duchamps has many facets. If you made a portrait of Duchamps, it would have to be a polyfaceted portrait. And in fact, it exists, because there were these recreative photographs that the Dadaists did take of themselves. There's one of Picabia, there's one of Henri-Pierre Rocher, for instance. But there's one of Duchamps that we just saw, this photograph where, with the game of the mirrors, he appears on different perspectives. So who is Duchamps? And I think the exhibition would have to show that he's different people. Actually, he's a man and a woman, because he's Rose c'est la vie as well. He's the bourgeois son of a bourgeois family. His father was a notary in Normandy. He's a hero of modern art. He's also a surrealist. While he claimed he would never belong to a movement, he had this deep connection and friendship with Breton. But at the same time, he's someone who works alone. So the idea of the exhibition is to have this really prismatic structure to show the works. The idea is really to give access to the works themselves that we seldom see, because a lot of them don't travel or don't travel often. So the huge work is actually to assemble the work, and then to of course create something that people will understand with a chronology, and you can follow Duchamps when he invents the ready-made, for instance, and then when he finishes the Grand Verre, and then when there's the boîte en valise. But at the same time, to make chemin de traverse, I don't know how you say that in English, but crossways maybe, and to show the different dialogues that he had with so many artists from the past, some that he didn't know, like Dürer, like Da Vinci, for example, or people he knew really well, like Picabia, like Man Ray, women, like Catherine Dreyer, who was really important with the adventure of the Société Anonyme, and to show that there are different ways of seeing Duchamps and not one way. The main idea is to get away from the definitive, peremptory views on Duchamps that will set once and for all who he was, what he was doing, with only one idea, and to allow the show to host, welcome different views on Duchamps, because I believe that if there is a truth on Duchamps, it lies in the multiplicity, in the equivocity, rather than the contrary.
Mm-hmm. Can I just respond to that? Because you're mentioning something which is clear but never foregrounded in terms of his practice. So when we read about Duchamps, there's many different Duchamps. Okay, there's also Rose la vie and Duchamps, but there's Duchamps the artist, and then almost as a footnote, and in other books, they speak about Duchamps, who was the exhibition designer, and Duchamps the curator, Duchamps the writer, Duchamps the critic, Duchamps who assembled the Société Anonyme. But I believe that this was very much part of his practice, that for him it was a practice which was not simply about making objects or paintings for galleries, but also the exhibition design. And even there, so there's in some of the slides, you see the exhibition where he has, for the second surrealist exhibition in New York, you have string. And people speak about this, but in my research, what I discovered it wasn't just string. It was basically, I think it was called fire cotton. It's a string that you use to light fireworks. And he installed it, and then it exploded, and it all disappeared, and he had to do it again. But he was, even in the detail of that, he was very precise. And that's, it would be interesting to see how we integrate his ideas as a writer, critic, curator, exhibition designer into the concept of an artist who was also an art historian, but also a librarian, which was a huge part of his practice, was deciding to work in a library.
Mm-hmm. Let me end with a last question for you, Kendell, because you write, Duchamps is an artist that is obsessed with the detail. And then my question to you is, aren't all artists?
I wish. We've lost the craft. All true artists are obsessed with details. All true artists scan art history and make works of art which is about this open source language. But unfortunately, something came along called the art market. And artists became decorators, and they make ornaments. They make pretty pictures to sell to people, exactly what Duchamps was protesting against. Art which is not in the service of the mind. And those are not artists for me. Those are producers of luxury brands.
Okay. So let me open this conversation to the audience on this note. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. So I don't know if someone dares, wants.
Wait, there's a microphone.
So it was just a question about the fourth spatial dimension that Duchamps, apparently by the art historian Lindsay Graham Henderson, was apparently a big advocator of, and even considered himself a mathematician in some sort of amateur sense. How does that play a role into the things that you were saying?
Well, that fourth dimension aspect of his work is famous. He famously was linked to a pseudo mathematician and working on the fourth dimension. He writes about it. So, but to me, it also shows that what I was saying before about the meaning in his work, he was also searching that through the fourth dimension. Why? Because the fourth dimension for him, it allowed him to think that what we see in 3 dimensions around us is just the shadow of something that we can't see, that is the fourth dimension. So, to me, it's just the image of something that escapes, that you can't see, but you have to search for it. There's something else, and the whole picture is never right in front of you. There's always something else that you have to search for.
There was another question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is maybe a question for Jeanne Brun more. I would like to know, for the exhibition in Pompidou, are you working together with the MoMA and Philadelphia Museum on the concept of the exhibition, or you are doing an exhibition that will be each time a unique one? And
Well, thank you for this question. Of course, we have to work with MoMA in Philadelphia for the exhibition because of the works themselves. And the 1977 exhibition was already an event because the Philadelphia Museum, because they have the most important collection of Duchamps, of course, agreed to lend most of their works to Europe. So we've recreated that group, and we discuss exhibitions together, but we believe that there are reasons for us to do different exhibitions in the context of America, where Duchamps was, arrived and was seen in a way, and in Europe, where he was raised in a different context with the European culture, the European painting, etc. And so I think we're going to have slightly different exhibitions, visions on Duchamps, and spaces as well, because you know that our space at the Grand Palais, because the Pompidou is closing at the end of this year, will be big. It's the big galleries of the Grand Palais, so 2,000 square meters, but also has its own constraints, of course. So working to synthesize my answer, working together, but doing, different things.
Hi, this might be a good question for Kendell. Your book traces Duchamp's influence back to Renaissance and neoclassical masters, which might seem surprising given Duchamp's radical break from tradition. How do you think this deep historical grounding shapes or complicates understanding of Duchamps as a revolutionary figure?
So I didn't hear the last part.
How do you think this deep historical grounding shapes or complicates or the understanding of Duchamps as a revolutionary figure?
It's a very good question, and I believe it makes Duchamps even more revolutionary, because it's consoling to imagine him as an iconoclast. It's consoling to think that if you just take an object from the street and put it in the gallery, that makes you revolutionary. Today, that's old hat and very banal, and that's the equivalent for me of a dad joke. It's easy. Okay, in 1917, it was less easy. But artists today who are dragging objects from the street and putting it in a gallery, well, that's dad jokes. That's boring and banal. What Duchamps does is he gives us a whole nother way of understanding the iconoclast, which is, how do you take an art historical discourse? And the quote that Jeanne read is really the precise way of understanding how he's able to take this long history that we've taken for granted. And what we discover, if you take the time to read the book, the fascinating thing is not only Duchamps that we haven't looked at, but Poussin. So a lot of my book actually speaks about Poussin, Etienne Arcadia Ego, and in fact Poussin was the first one that was quoting Leonardo da Vinci. And Duchamps is quoting Poussin, is quoting Leonardo. And what happens is that we end up in this habit of thinking, if something's consoling, well, then it must be true. Just because you read it in an art historical book, well, it must be true, because, it's fascinating that on the subject of Dürer and Leonardo da Vinci and Poussin, Panofsky, the great art historian, never saw the links. Why not? And I don't know why. I'm sure I'm not the first person in the world to see these links. And I certainly believe that Duchamps saw those links. And that makes him infinitely more radical and revolutionary, because he's taking something and he's amplifying it in ways that we haven't yet even begin to understand. My book is not very big, it's not academic, and I do hope that a real art historian will take the book as a departure point and actually go into the layers and the levels of what he was really doing, because I think there's a matrix in there of how he was dissecting history in very complex and fascinating ways.
May I add just something? I think in the detail and what you just said lies also the idea that when you say iconoclast, when you say he takes an object and he puts it in the museum or in the gallery or someplace like that, you might want to hear that he doesn't care, that he's a nihilist, like most Dadaists were seen as. But Duchamps, it's not that he doesn't care. He tries another way of being an artist that doesn't destroy meaning. It dissociates lieux communs, common places. But then it creates the possibility of other meanings. So there's something really that Gourmand calls creative, but that's not nihilist at all, or not je m'en foutiste at all. It creates really something that is richer, more dense than what he took at the beginning.
There's another question.
Simple and maybe stupid question. Why do you call your book Endgame?
The word endgame gave me an opportunity to use the letter N reversed, because a great deal of the book speaks about the reversed letter N, which speaks about the nth dimension, which Dorma's question was referring to. But Duchamps was obsessed with chess. And endgame is that moment in chess where you arrive and there's very few pieces left. And so it's a reference to the chess player, but also in English, endgame means your final goal, your final ambition. Like, what is the long-term vision that he had in terms of what he was trying to achieve? And when we look at Duchamps as the nihilist, as the simpleton who did something which today is really a dad joke, we lose the keys for the intelligence that was behind putting the urinal into the gallery. And so Endgame is able to speak about both the chess playing, which is a complex strategy game of many different pieces, black and white, which in his Étant donné, his final work, you have a black and white squares on the floor, and that's the thing, is that black and white is two things at the same time. And Endgame allowed me to be able to suggest and speak about all these different ways and layers without necessarily arriving at a conclusion, because in the end game it takes a long time to, I mean, if you play chess, you know, when you get down to a few pieces, and it takes a while to understand.
Another question in the back.
Hello. Yeah, my question is related also. You mentioned Normandy and Normandy de Marcel. I think that it's one of the important things, because as you was talking about the details, in a Grand Verre you have this bottle of Benedictine. I guess it's on the left side, and it's a detail with whom Duchamps was obsessed. I think that also as a teenager he was going and he was like looking to this nuns who was doing this liquor and doing this kind of emballage for this liquor. And I think that also he reproduced later the small image, small painting that was on a cover of this liqueur of Benedictine. And I know that there is more than, I guess, 64 or 68 objects related to the specific subjects in the collection of Centre Pompidou. The research of Anne de Gell related to Marcel Duchamps and La Bouteille de Benedictine. I think that he was talking about the interest of the artist to the detail, and it's one of the, I would say, perfect example can show us how he was obsessed with the details, and some details was coming from his childhood or like teenagerhood.
And do you have a question?
My question was like how in your because he was talking about Normandy, but you talk it like quite quickly, because he was talking about this bourgeois child with a father who was a notaire. And I would like to, because I know about like father, but what was the relationship with the mother? What was it from this side?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer that question correctly, but he was very, when I mentioned Normandy, I mentioned it as, you know, for the 1977 show, it had struck people to see this big market hall from Normandy. And I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense. I'm not saying that it's not important. Actually, we know that until the end, Marcel Duchamps was really linked to his family, the people who stayed in his house, because the house he grew up in Blainville-Crevon, was then sold to another family. His parents went in another place, and so they left this house that they used to rent to another family. And until his death, Marcel returned there, and so the new owners of the house And he wrote to them when he came with Tini, his wife. He wanted to show her the place, and he returned. So it's obviously important. What I was trying to say is that it's important, as are all of the other things. And when you mentioned this Benedictine, there's this artist in France called Mathieu Mercier. He gathered, he's collecting it, it's actually an ongoing project, all of the objects from the time when Duchamps could have seen them, and he buys them. Like, for instance, the hat rack that he could have seen in the Saint-Étienne catalogue of objects, or the corkscrew, because there's this, as everything in this is a mystery in Duchamp's work, people were wondering, is it a corkscrew? What's this form? Does it mean? Is it something else? And so Mathieu Mercier found the actual corkscrew that's the exact same shape as the corkscrew in Tomb. So I think he proceeded that way. The material of his work was everything he saw around him, whether from Normandy in his childhood, or in art history, or in the American context. And everything was this material that he could use, associate, dissociate, again, the same idea, and combine in another meaning.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, Kendell.